If you walk through the history books of the Western world, there's a chapter that shines brighter than almost any other. It is the story of 1947, 2 years after the guns of the Second World War had finally fallen silent. The narrative we are sold is one of unprecedented benevolence, a moment when the United States, standing tall as the only remaining superpower, looked across the Atlantic at a broken, starving, and burning Europe and decided to open its wallet. We are told that the Marshall Plan, officially known as the European Recovery Program, was an act of charity so grand that it saved Western civilization from collapse. We are taught that the $13 billion transferred from American taxpayers to European treasuries was a gift, a shield against communism, and a helping hand to former allies and enemies alike. But there is a different version of this story. It is a story not of charity, but of calculation. It is a story not of saving Europe, but of buying it. When you strip away the newsreels of smiling children receiving American bread and look at the cold, hard ledger of economic reality, the Marshall Plan reveals itself to be something far more complex and far more cynical. It was the largest vendor financing scheme in human history. It was a mechanism designed to solve a catastrophic American economic crisis by exporting it to Europe. And most importantly, it was the specific geopolitical maneuver that dethroned the British pound, dismantled the European colonial empires, and installed the United States dollar as the undisputed king of global commerce. It wasn't a rescue mission, it was a hostile takeover disguised as a donation. To understand the world we live in today, where the Federal Reserve dictates the pulse of the global economy, we have to go back to the rubble of 1947 and look at the trap that was set. To understand the trap, you first have to understand the desperation of the prey. By the winter of 1947, Europe was not just recovering, it was dying. The war had destroyed the delicate machinery of modern life. Railways were twisted steel, bridges were in the rivers, and factories were hollow shells. But the physical destruction was secondary to the financial annihilation. Britain, France, Germany, and Italy were bankrupt. They had liquidated their gold reserves, sold off their foreign investments, and taken on massive debts just to survive the war. Now, peace had come, but there was no commerce. The currencies of Europe were worthless paper. A German shopkeeper wouldn't trade a loaf of bread for a wheelbarrow of Reichsmarks. He wanted cigarettes or chocolate. The trade arteries of the continent had suffered a cardiac arrest. And then the winter came. The winter of 1946 to 47 was one of the coldest in recorded history. Coal supplies froze in the stockpiles. Power stations shut down. People in London and Berlin were freezing to death in their homes. The specter of starvation was very real. In this vacuum of misery, political radicalism began to fester. The communist parties in France and Italy were surging in popularity, not necessarily because people were ideological Marxists, but because the Soviets promised order and food while the capitalist West seemed to offer only chaos and cold. This is the backdrop we are usually shown, a desperate Europe needing a savior. But what is rarely discussed is the panic happening on the other side of the ocean in Washington, D.C. The United States was terrified, but not for the reasons you might think. The U.S. had emerged from the war as the factory of the world. During the conflict, the American economy had tripled in size. It had built a manufacturing juggernaut to supply the Allied war machine. Unemployment, which had plagued the U.S. during the Great Depression, had effectively vanished. But now, the war was over. The government contracts that kept Detroit and Pittsburgh humming were canceled. The millions of soldiers were coming home looking for jobs. The American ruling class was haunted by the memory of 1929. They knew that the Great Depression was caused by a crisis of overproduction, factories making too much stuff with nobody to buy it. In 1947, they were staring down the barrel of the exact same gun. The U.S. was producing 50% of the world's industrial goods, but the American consumer couldn't buy it all. They needed export markets. They needed to sell their steel, their cars, their wheat, and their machinery to Europe. There was just one massive, insurmountable problem. Europe had no money. Specifically, they had no dollars. This was known as the dollar gap. It was the defining economic crisis of the late 1940s. European nations wanted to buy American goods to rebuild their countries, but they had nothing to pay with. Their own currencies were unconvertible and useless in international trade. They had no gold left to ship to Fort Knox. The international trading system was locked frozen. If Europe couldn't buy, American factories would stop selling. If American factories stopped selling, they would close. If they closed, mass unemployment would return, and the Great Depression would resume, perhaps leading to a communist revolution within the United States itself. The United States didn't help Europe because it was kind. It helped Europe because it was cornered. The Marshall Plan was the solution to the American liquidity crisis. The logic was brilliant in its simplicity. The U.S. government would tax the American public. It would take that money and give it to European governments. European governments would then use that exact same money to pay American corporations for goods. It was a closed loop. The money never really left the American ecosystem. It went from the U.S. Treasury to Europe and immediately bounced back to General Motors, U.S. Steel, and American farmers. It was a massive subsidy for American industry, ensuring that the post-war boom continued. But for Europe, this gift came with invisible strings that would slowly tighten into chains. The aid wasn't a blank check. It was a voucher system. You couldn't just take the dollars and trade with whoever you wanted. You were locked into the American supply chain. This began the process of reorienting the entire European economy away from its traditional internal focus and toward the Atlantic. But to call it just a subsidy is to underestimate the genius of the plan. It was also a weapon. When Secretary of State George Marshall announced the plan at Harvard University in June 1947, he spoke in vague, noble terms about fighting hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. He explicitly stated that the policy was directed not against any country or doctrine, but this was diplomatic theater. The plan was explicitly designed to isolate the Soviet Union and, more subtly, to break the economic independence of Great Britain and France. The Soviet Union was actually invited to participate in the initial discussions. This was a calculated bluff. The American architects of the plan, men like George Kennan and Will Clayton, knew that the Soviets could never accept the terms of the aid. The terms required participating nations to open their economic books to U.S. auditors, to share sensitive industrial data, and to integrate their economies with the West. For a command economy like the USSR, this was impossible. As predicted, Moscow walked out, denouncing the plan as capitalist imperialism. And this was exactly what Washington wanted. It drew a hard line across the continent. By accepting the money, Western Europe was effectively signing a loyalty oath. You were now part of the dollar bloc. However, the Soviet containment is the part of the story everyone knows. The trap element is much more visible when we look at how the U.S. treated its closest allies, particularly the British Empire. In 1947, the British pound sterling was still a major global reserve currency. Roughly half of the world's trade was still conducted in pounds, largely within the British Commonwealth. This sterling area was a closed garden where Britain enjoyed preferential trade rights with its colonies and dominions. It was a barrier to American economic expansion. The U.S. hated the sterling area. They viewed imperial preference, the system where British colonies could trade with Britain cheaper than with the U.S., as a violation of free markets. The Marshall Plan became the battering ram to break down these walls. The aid was conditional on liberalizing trade. In plain English, this meant dismantling the protectionist barriers that held the British Empire together. The U.S. used its financial leverage to force European nations to lower tariffs and accept American goods without restriction. For a country like France or Britain, desperate for cash to keep the lights on, there was no choice. They had to sign. But the most insidious mechanism of the Marshall Plan wasn't the aid itself. It was something called counterpart funds. This is the technical detail that most history books gloss over, yet it was the key to American political control over Europe. Here's how it worked. When the U.S. government approved, say, $100 million of wheat for France, they didn't just hand the French government the cash, they shipped the wheat. The French government would then sell this wheat to its own bakers and citizens for French francs. So the French government now had a pile of cash, millions of francs collected from its own people. This pile of money was called the counterpart fund. Logic suggests this money belonged to France, but under the rules of the Marshall Plan, it didn't. The French government could not spend a single francs of these counterpart funds without the express permission of the American administrator in Paris. Think about the implications of that. The United States held a veto power over the domestic budget of sovereign European nations. If the French government wanted to use that money to build public housing, the American administrator could say, "No, that's too socialist. We want you to use it to build a port infrastructure that helps American ships dock." If the Italian government wanted to subsidize a certain industry that competed with American exports, Washington could simply freeze the funds. It was a soft coup. The U.S. didn't need to invade these countries to dictate their policies. They simply controlled the purse strings of their reconstruction. They could shape the internal politics of Europe to ensure that the center-right, pro-business, pro-American parties stayed in power, and that the socialists and communists were starved of resources and influence. By 1948, the trap was set. The ships were arriving, the factories were restarting, and the people were being fed. But the price was the structural independence of the European continent. Europe was being rebuilt, yes, but it was being rebuilt as an annex of the American economy. The dollar was being injected into the veins of global commerce, replacing the gold standard and the pound sterling with a system based entirely on faith in the United States and its ability to consume. To fully grasp the magnitude of the American financial conquest, we must look specifically at the United States' greatest ally and its greatest economic rival, the British Empire. In the grand narrative of the 20th century, we often view the transition of power from London to New York as a natural, peaceful handing over of the torch. It is portrayed as a father retiring and handing the family business to his son, but the reality was far more akin to a foreclosure. The United States did not just wait for the British Empire to collapse. It actively accelerated the process through financial asphyxiation. The Marshall Plan was the final nail in the coffin of British monetary independence, but to understand how the trap snapped shut, we have to look at the brutal skirmishes that preceded it. In 1945, Britain was bankrupt, but it was still a giant. The Union Jack still flew over a quarter of the world's population. Crucially, the British economy was protected by a fortress wall known as the Sterling Area. This was a closed economic bloc comprising the Commonwealth nations and colonies. Inside this wall, trade was conducted in pounds. Countries like Australia, India, and Egypt held their reserves in sterling in London banks. They traded with each other using a system of imperial preference, which meant tariffs were lower for British goods than for American ones. For the rising American corporate titans, the sterling area was an intolerable obstacle. It was a vast section of the global market, millions of consumers, that was essentially off-limits to American exports. Washington was determined to break this wall down. They wanted multilateral trade, a polite euphemism for a world where American goods could compete everywhere without tariffs. The opportunity to smash the sterling area came when Britain, desperate for cash to rebuild its bombed cities and feed its people, came to Washington hat in hand in 1946, asking for a loan. The negotiations were brutal. The British dispatched the legendary economist John Maynard Keynes to negotiate. Keynes expected a grant, a thank you gift for Britain's loan stand against Hitler. Instead, he faced American negotiators who treated him like a distressed borrower in a pawn shop. The U.S. agreed to loan Britain $3.75 billion, but the conditions were poison. The most lethal condition was convertibility. The U.S. demanded that Britain make the pound sterling fully convertible into U.S. dollars within 1 year. This sounded technical, but it was a death sentence. It meant that anyone in the world who held pounds, whether an Australian merchant or an Egyptian government official, could walk into the Bank of England and demand U.S. dollars in exchange. Washington knew exactly what would happen. Because the U.S. was the only country making things people wanted, everyone would dump their pounds to get dollars. When the deadline came in July 1947, just weeks after General Marshall's speech, the trap was sprung. The moment convertibility went live, the run on the bank began. The convertibility crisis was a financial bloodbath. Britain's gold and dollar reserves, borrowed at such high political cost, were drained in weeks. It was a run on the pound, orchestrated by American stipulations. After 6 weeks of hemorrhaging wealth, London suspended convertibility, humiliated. The lesson was clear. The pound was no longer a global master. It was a derivative of the dollar. Britain was broke, its defenses were shattered, and it had nowhere left to turn but the Marshall Plan. By the time the Marshall Plan funds began to flow, Britain was no longer negotiating as an equal. They were a client state. The aid money kept the British social welfare state on life support, paying for the new National Health Service and housing, but it came at the cost of geopolitical autonomy. The U.S. used the leverage of the Marshall Plan to dictate the dismantling of the British Empire's strategic assets. Throughout the late 1940s, whenever Britain tried to assert an independent foreign policy, whether in the Middle East, with its crucial oil reserves, or in Asia, the pressure from Washington was subtle but firm. The message was always the same: we are paying your bills. Do not cause trouble. The U.S. began to step into the voids left by retreating British power. In Greece and Turkey, where Britain could no longer afford to maintain influence, American dollars and advisors moved in under the Truman Doctrine. The Marshall Plan funded the transition of global policing duties from the exhausted British Tommy to the well-fed American GI. But the Marshall Plan had an even grander ambition than just neutering Britain. It aimed to completely re-engineer the economic geography of continental Europe. The American planners looked at the map of Europe with its dozens of borders, different currencies, and endless tariffs, and saw inefficiency. They saw a fragmented market that was hard for American corporations to penetrate at scale. General Motors didn't want to deal with 20 different sets of customs rules. They wanted one massive market, just like they had back home in the USA. Therefore, a core requirement of the Marshall Plan was European integration. The U.S. explicitly demanded that European nations lower trade barriers between themselves. They forced the French and the Germans, mortal enemies who had slaughtered each other for centuries, to sit at the same table and coordinate their coal and steel production. This was the birth of the European coal and steel community, the direct ancestor of the European Union. We are taught that the EU was a European dream, born from the desire for peace. While true, it is also true that the incubator was built in Washington. The United States wanted a united Europe, not as a political rival, but as an economic subsidiary. A unified European market would be a perfect sponge for American excess production. By forcing these economies to integrate, the U.S. was creating a standardized landing zone for American capital. They were building the highway so they could drive the cars on it. This integration also served to solve the German question. American strategists knew that Europe could not recover without German industry. The Morgenthau Plan, the idea to turn Germany into a helpless agrarian pasture, was scrapped because it made no economic sense. A poor Germany meant a poor Europe, and a poor Europe meant no customers for America. But a revived Germany was terrifying to the French. The Marshall Plan solved this by binding Germany's recovery to the rest of Europe. Germany would be allowed to rebuild its factories, but only if its economy was inextricably tied to the Atlantic system, supervised by American creditors. The genius of this arrangement was that it replaced military occupation with economic entanglement. You didn't need to keep a boot on Germany AS neck if you owned the bank that financed their factory. The Volkswagen Beetle became a symbol of this new order. A German car, fueled by cheap Middle Eastern oil secured by the U.S. Navy, sold to American consumers, generating dollars that flowed back to Frankfurt to pay off Reconstruction loans. The circle was unbroken. However, there was one group that was not invited to this party: the working-class movements that had resisted fascism. In the immediate post-war years, labor unions in France and Italy were powerful and militant. They wanted to nationalize industries and run them for the benefit of the workers. This terrified the American business elite. They saw nationalization as a stepping stone to Bolshevism. The Marshall Plan contained a hidden enforcement mechanism against this. The counterpart funds we discussed, the local currency controlled by the U.S., were often used to stabilize governments that were willing to break strikes. In France, in 1947 and 1948, when communist-led unions launched massive strikes that threatened to paralyze the country, the French government, bolstered by Marshall Plan assurance and supplies, took a hard line. The message from the U.S. was clear: the aid stops if the communists win. The CIA, which was formed in 1947, used the cover of Marshall Plan operations to funnel money to anti-communist political parties and moderate unions. They split the labor movement, funding business-friendly unions to compete with the radical ones. It was a massive intervention in the democratic processes of sovereign nations, justified by the economic necessity of the plan. The result was that the post-war European economy was reconstructed on a capitalist model that mirrored the American system, focused on productivity, consumerism, and private ownership, rather than the socialist models many Europeans had voted for. By 1950, the operation was largely complete. The British pound was broken. The European empires were dissolving. The radical labor movements had been sidelined. And the economies of Western Europe were growing at record speeds, fueled by cheap energy and American technology. But they were growing inside a cage. It was a golden cage, certainly. Life was better, people were eating, cars were being bought, but the bars were made of the US dollar. Europe had traded its geopolitical soul for a higher standard of living. And just as the trap seemed secure, a new challenge emerged. The Korean War broke out in 1950, and the US economy shifted once again. The dollar gap that had terrified Washington, the shortage of dollars in Europe, suddenly began to reverse. Europe was exporting again. They were earning dollars. And as they accumulated these dollars, they remembered the old rules of the game. They remembered that dollars were supposed to be as good as gold. They looked at the growing pile of green paper in their central banks and asked a question that would eventually bring the whole system to a breaking point. Can we have our gold back now? By the 1950s and 60s, the Marshall Plan appeared to be a miraculous success. The ruins of Berlin and Tokyo had been replaced by gleaming factories. The German economic miracle was in full swing. French vineyards and Italian fashion houses were exporting to the world. The specter of starvation was gone, replaced by the rise of the consumer middle class. On the surface, it seemed the United States had achieved exactly what it set out to do: stabilize the world. But beneath the surface, the trap was mutating. The dynamic of the game was shifting from a dollar gap to a dollar glut. And the United States was about to discover the immense power and the immense danger of being the world's banker. In the late 1940s, Europe had been desperate for dollars. By the 1960s, Europe was drowning in them. The US was running massive balance of payment deficits. It was spending money all over the globe, maintaining hundreds of military bases, fighting the war in Vietnam, and funding the Great Society social programs at home. To pay for all this, the Federal Reserve simply printed more dollars. These dollars flowed out of the US and settled in the central banks of Europe and Japan. This created a bizarre and historically unprecedented economic reality. The French finance minister, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, famously called it America's exorbitant privilege. Here is how the privilege worked. If France wanted to buy oil or copper, it had to produce wine or cars, sell them to the world, earn money, and then buy the resources. France had to work to buy things. The United States, however, could simply print green pieces of paper and use them to buy real goods from the rest of the world. But the privilege went even deeper. American corporations, flush with these printed dollars, began a massive shopping spree in Europe. Giants like Ford, General Motors, and IBM started buying up European companies, factories, and real estate. To European leaders, it looked like a heist. The Americans were buying Europe's tangible, hard assets, their heritage and their industry, and paying for it with paper currency that Washington could print at will. It was as if someone walked into your house, bought your furniture with monopoly money, and you were forced by law to accept it. The Marshall Plan had addicted Europe to the dollar system, but now that system was being used to hollow out European sovereignty. The U.S. was effectively forcing Europe to finance America's foreign wars. When the U.S. printed money to pay for a helicopter in Vietnam, that inflation eventually found its way to Paris and Bonn. Europe was importing America's inflation. They were subsidizing their own geopolitical subservience. Enter the one man who refused to play along, President Charles de Gaulle of France. If the Marshall Plan was the trap, de Gaulle was the wolf chewing off his own leg to escape it. He was a fierce nationalist who had never forgiven the Anglo-Americans for treating France like a junior partner during the war. He looked at the economic landscape of the 1960s and saw exactly what was happening. He realized that the gold standard, the promise that every US dollar could be redeemed for gold at $35 an ounce, had become a lie. The US had printed far more paper dollars than it had gold in Fort Knox to back them. It was a classic bank run waiting to happen, but on a global scale. As long as everyone pretended the dollar was as good as gold, the American empire could continue to spend without limit. In a famous press conference in 1965, de Gaulle blew the whistle. He declared that the dollar-S dominance was no longer based on economic reality, but on a power imbalance. He demanded a return to a real gold standard, one where no country has a privilege. But he didn't just talk, he acted. De Gaulle ordered the Bank of France to take the accumulated mountain of US dollars it had earned from trade and cash them in. He demanded the gold. It was a declaration of financial war. The French Navy was reportedly used to transport bullion across the Atlantic. Other nations, seeing France get its gold, began to get nervous. Germany, Spain, and Switzerland started quietly asking for their gold back too. The flow of gold out of the U.S. turned into a torrent. In the late 1940s, the U.S. held 70% of the world's monetary gold. By the late 1960s, the vaults at Fort Knox were draining at an alarming rate. The trap was breaking. The U.S. had used the dollar to control Europe, but now Europe was using the dollar's convertibility to drain American wealth. Washington panicked. They tried to pressure Germany not to redeem their dollars. They sent diplomatic threats. They emphasized that American troops were the only thing standing between West Germany and the Soviet Red Army. The implicit threat was clear. Keep holding our paper dollars, or maybe we won't be there to defend you when the tanks roll in. The Germans, dependent on U.S. security, largely complied, agreeing to hold onto the devaluing dollars as a security fee. But the economic gravity was undeniable. The U.S. could not afford the Vietnam War and the Great Society while maintaining the gold peg. The markets knew the dollar was overvalued. Speculators began betting against the dollar, attacking the currency. The British pound, the weaker partner in the system, collapsed and was devalued in 1967. The pressure moved entirely to the dollar. By 1971, the situation was critical. The United States was facing the first trade deficit of the 20th century. The gold coverage had dropped to a point where if all foreign nations asked for their gold, the U.S. would be bankrupt. The trap the U.S. had built, the integrated global financial system, was now threatening to destroy the U.S. economy itself. The Marshall Plan had integrated Europe so well that Europe was now strong enough to call America I say bluff. The U.S. had to make a choice. Stop printing money and crash the American economy into a recession to save the gold standard, or break the promised default on the gold obligations and change the rules of the game entirely. The trap was about to enter its final and most permanent phase. The U.S. wasn't going to release Europe from the trap. They were going to rebuild the cage with stronger steel. They were going to move from a system backed by gold to a system backed by nothing but force. On the weekend of August 13th, 1971, President Richard Nixon summoned his top economic advisors to a secret meeting at Camp David. The mood was funeral. The media was kept in the dark. The phone lines were cut. The greatest default in the history of finance was about to be engineered. On Sunday night, August 15th, Nixon interrupted popular television broadcasts, including Bonanza, to speak to the nation. He announced that he was closing the gold window. In bureaucratic language, he suspended the convertibility of the US dollar into gold. In plain English, the United States told the world, "You know all those dollars you're holding? The ones we promised were as good as gold? We lied. You can't have the gold. You're stuck with the paper." This was the Nixon Shock. It was the moment the trap slammed shut for good, overnight. The billions of dollars held by European central banks, wealth accumulated through decades of hard work and factory production, were transformed from claims on hard assets into fiat currency, backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the United States. Europe was furious, but helpless. They couldn't invade the US to get the gold. They couldn't dump the dollar because doing so would destroy the value of their own reserves. They were hostages to the American currency. The Marshall Plan had integrated them so deeply into the dollar system that they could not leave it without committing economic suicide. But Washington knew that faith wasn't enough to sustain a global empire. Without gold, why would anyone hold dollars? Why wouldn't Germany just start trading with France in marks or francs? The US needed a new anchor. They needed a commodity that was even more essential than gold. They found it in the black sands of the Middle East. Enter the petrodollar. In 1974, amidst the chaos of the oil crisis where prices had quadrupled, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger made a quiet trip to Saudi Arabia. He wasn't there to talk about peace. He was there to close the deal of the century. The terms were simple and brutal. The United States would provide the House of Saud with absolute military protection. We would sell them the most advanced weapons on earth and guarantee their dynasty against all enemies, foreign and domestic. In exchange, the Saudis had to do just two things. First, they had to price every single barrel of oil in US dollars. Not marks, not yens, not gold. Only dollars. Second, they had to take the billions in surplus profits they made from selling that oil and recycle them back into US Treasury bonds, effectively loaning the money back to the US government to fund its deficit. This was the masterstroke that cemented the legacy of the Marshall Plan. Think about the chain of events. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe's industry, making the continent thirsty for oil to run its factories and cars. The petrodollar system ensured that to get that oil, Europe needed US dollars. This created a permanent artificial demand for the American currency. If Germany wanted to heat its homes, it had to buy dollars. To get dollars, it had to send Mercedes and BMWs to America. The United States could simply print money to buy oil. Europe had to work for it. The trap had evolved into a perpetual motion machine of wealth extraction. This system fundamentally changed the nature of the global economy. It allowed the United States to run deficits that would crush any other nation. It allowed Americans to consume more than they produced for decades, funded by the labor of the nations they had saved in 1947. When we look back at the Marshall Plan today, we must look past the commemorative plaques and the black and white photos of smiling diplomats. We have to see the long game. The Marshall Plan was the seed capital for the American empire. It was the investment that yielded the highest return in history. It bought loyalty, it bought markets, but most importantly, it bought the infrastructure of control. It ensured that when the global financial nervous system was built, all the wiring ran through New York. It ensured that the SWIFT banking system, the World Bank, and the IMF were all designed with American keys in the locks. Today, when the US sanctions a country, cutting them off from the global financial system with the stroke of a pen, they are using the weapons forged in 1947. The dominance of the dollar is not an accident of history, and it certainly isn't a result of the free market. It is the result of a specific, calculated strategy to turn the wreckage of World War II into a captive market. The Marshall Plan was never about charity. It was about ensuring that the sun would never set on the American economy. And for the last 80 years, Europe has lived in the light of that sun, warm, well-fed, and comfortable, but ultimately casting a shadow that belongs to someone else. The trap is still open. We are all still living inside it. History is written by the victors, but economics reveals the truth. If you found value in this analysis of the Marshall Plan, please hit the like button. It helps the algorithms share this history with more people who need to see it. I want to hear your perspective in the comments. Do you believe the Marshall Plan was primarily an act of charity, or was it, as we discussed, a calculated geopolitical trap? Let me know your thoughts down below. If you know someone who's interested in how money really runs the world, share this video with them. And finally, to ensure you don't miss our next deep dive into the rise and fall of global powers, make sure you're subscribed to Econ Empires. I'll see you in the next video.